Good afternoon and welcome to our live webinar, Navigating the Landscape of Art-Endowed Foundations, hosted by PKF O'Connor Davies. All attendees are in listen mode only. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items so you know how to participate in today's call. We've taken a screenshot of the attendee interface, and you should see something that looks like this on your own computer desktop in the upper right corner. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenters by typing your questions in the questions pane of the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the webcast. We have a lot of material to cover, and if time permits, we will make an effort to respond. If we cannot get to your questions, a response will be sent post-event. This webinar is offering 1 CPE credit in specialized knowledge, and you will need to respond to 3 of the polling questions to receive credit. If you're having difficulty responding to a question, it is recommended you come out of full screen mode to respond. CPE certificates will be issued within 8 to 10 days via email. A recording of today's webinar will be made available to you via email a few hours after the event. At the end of the webinar, we do have a very short survey which will be prompted, and your response is greatly appreciated. At this time, I would like to introduce Scott Brown, partner of the Private Foundations Practice with PKF O'Connor Davies. Scott?
Thank you, Harleen, for that introduction, and welcome everybody. I'm very excited about today's topic of Art-Endowed Foundations. Hope everybody attending is as well. We have 3 tremendous speakers on hand, each adding their own specialized expertise to this discussion that I think everyone will find both informative and very enlightening on this topic. Before we get to our speakers and they introduce themselves, briefly touching on our firm here and our private foundation practice. So PKF O'Connor Davies Foundation Practice services over 550 private foundations and grant-making organizations nationally. We do so with a group of about 40 individuals, which also includes 5 partners who specialize in both audit and tax compliance in the foundation and grant-making community. We also like to keep our community informed through monthly foundation thought leadership, quarterly webinars, and also an annual private foundation symposium. Now, I'm happy to announce that once again, our private foundation symposium will both be live and hybrid, and this will take place at our offices on 245 Park, December 5th. And please keep an eye out for a more formal invitation in your email in the next few weeks. Now, I know I could probably introduce one of these speakers and not really fumble or embarrass myself. However, the other 2, I think I'll let them introduce themselves, and I'll even let Anan introduce himself as well. So as I mentioned, terrific speakers on hand for today's topic. And Karen, if you could kick us off and introduce yourself, that would be great.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for including me today. I'm Karen Cardos, and I lead philanthropic advisory at Citi Private Bank. Basically, that means helping our clients to think a little bit more strategically about their philanthropy, helping them think about mission or legacy, giving vehicles, implementation of granting models, and how they may want to monitor and evaluate their nonprofit partners.
Thank you, Karen. John?
Hi, I'm John Silberman. I'm a lawyer, partner at a small boutique law firm, Silberman Zaretsky, and we focus on the art world. And we represent artists and their estates and their families and their foundations, and collectors and their estates and foundations. We never represent dealers or auction houses or galleries or museums. And we focus on the business of the art world and the estate planning, estate-related and foundation side of the art world.
Great. Thank you, John. And last but not least, my fellow partner, Anan Samara.
Thank you, Scott. Anan Samara, I am a partner with the Private Foundation Practice here at PKF O'Connor Davies. Also co-chair the firm's DEI Council. I think Scott already mentioned about what we do as a firm and the Private Foundation Practice, but we also work with a number of artist-endowed foundations. And we thought this was a very important topic to discuss, and bringing these 2 great experts, I think, is key to this discussion.
Okay, and Anan's being a little modest when he talks about himself. He's really the leader in our foundation practice for the Art-Endowed Foundation. So that's why he's speaking and I'm moderating.
Thank you for that.
Yes, absolutely. Harleen, if we could launch the first polling question. So the first question before we kick this off, as she mentioned, there is going to be CPE given. We have to ask this every webinar. Are you looking to receive CPE credit for this? If you're not, maybe you answer yes and transfer it to one of us that need the CPE credit. Just throwing that out there. All right. We'll give everybody a couple more seconds and then we'll move on. Okay. All right, Harleen, I think you can close that. Great. So we thought it would be best to kind of discuss this as opposed to bringing up slides and talking to it. You know, we're going to have this discussion amongst the four of us here. And I guess before we kick off the really substantial portion about, you know, Art-Endowed foundations and the various considerations and tax compliances and so forth, we throw a softball question out there for you, John. And, you know, in your line of business, how do you define what an Art-Endowed foundation is? And I think it's also important for everybody attending so they actually know what we're going to be speaking about in the topic.
Okay, so primarily we usually refer to these, at least a subset of what you're referring to, as artist-endowed foundations. That's really the phrase that is bandied about. And these are almost always, with no exceptions that I can think of, private foundations. They may be operating foundations, they may be grant-making foundations, but they're private foundations that are established and funded by either the artist or the artist's family. Could be the artist and spouse and children. It's more often just the artist or the surviving spouse or the children after both of the parents are gone. And these foundations are funded usually with a combination of artwork and intellectual property in the artwork and money, and often archives as well. And then the foundation has to operate as a private foundation. We are using the phrase art-endowed foundations. Certainly there are collectors who build collections and decide to establish, again, a private foundation, which they endow with their collection and or funds, ideally both, to maintain the collection and deal with it in the future. The artist-endowed foundation sphere, these foundations almost always, but not always, are focused on the legacy of the artist and the reputation, the career of the artist, the scholarship, all the charitable educational aspects of that. For the private collectors, it's obviously much more about showing the collection. But they can also do other things. They can support other causes within the visual arts or outside.
Great, thank you for that, John. Very, very helpful and very informative. You know, following up on that, Karen, you know, with the clientele that you deal with in your line of work, you encounter a broad spectrum of individuals. You know, some, as John mentioned, artists, collectors of, you know, maybe just a few pieces, but very high net worth type of pieces, high net individuals with significant pieces, or even just art collectors. You know, what are kind of some of the insights and some of the considerations that you're having with your discussions with those types of clients when it comes to art-endowed foundations or artist-endowed foundations?
So we're actually seeing a spectrum of ways that people want to donate their art. So we definitely see art collectors that may be wanting to donate to public charities like a museum or an arts educational institution. We're seeing art collectors that are donating to private foundations, as John mentioned, both operating and non-operating. And we're seeing creators that want to endow private foundations with their artwork as well. One other thing that I wanted to mention is that We also see clients that use their art as an asset class, and then they can leverage their art and invest either in additional art or other types of investments. When I think about considerations for what clients need to think about, there's really a lot to consider. So let me just try to give some of the highlights. Really, we typically always recommend that you work with an experienced art advisor because they can help you navigate your donation to a public charity, right? We also recommend that you work with professionals like John, right? Because if you are going to set up some type of private foundation, then you really want to make sure that you're working with those that have knowledge base in that area. A lot of times when we're working with clients that want to donate to public charities, definitely you have to think about the institution that you're working with. Typically, if you work with an institution you've worked with before, it's a little bit easier to navigate. Many times, an institution doesn't want to take your whole collection. They may want to take maybe one individual piece, right? If your collection doesn't fit explicitly within their collection priorities or their curatorial focus, then they may not really be interested in the entire collection. We also find that sometimes objects might be better suited for research or educational purposes. So you really want to think about that. Many times in the public charity space, organizations have a formal review process, and that formal review process only comes up maybe once or twice a year. So timing could be critical from that perspective. If you're thinking about donating a piece of art, especially, maybe before year end or whatever the case may be. You also want to make sure that the institution can properly care for and preserve your artwork. And so many times you may also want to donate additional funding with a piece of art to ensure that the organization can maintain and preserve the art. Of course, provenance ownership is going to be critical. You might want to think about deascension, right? And then about how you want to be acknowledged when you make your gift.
Yeah, wow, that's really interesting. A lot of times I think when people think about this, they only think about, the giving aspect, and then once it's gone, that's pretty much kind of washing the hands of the relationship, right? But you're bringing up perfect points about providing funds for the maintaining of that art. Maybe that institution needs that if you're giving to a public charity or another place where that's going to be on display. You want to ensure that it's maintained properly and having that continuing relationship. So that's interesting aspects and considerations that people might not necessarily be thinking about when they first approach you and say, hey, I want to start this, or I want to donate this piece of art, and then you bring that up, and I'm sure there's a lot more conversations that are had afterwards.
Totally, and you bring up a good point just about exhibiting the piece itself, right? Like you may think, oh, they're going to show this all the time, and they may be thinking, no, we may be storing this, or you may be thinking, I want this to be able to go on the road, right? To be able to travel, for others to be able to enjoy it. So there are so many considerations, but hopefully that gives people an idea of some.
Yeah, great, thank you. And I get Anan, kind of looking at our end of the spectrum, right? The audit and tax considerations. What type of, I guess, tax considerations should individuals or artists or collectors be thinking about when deciding the types of entities to gift or donate or even set up a private foundation?
Sure. I think to Karen's point, there are really many considerations. Obviously, public is one vehicle you can donate to. But for this discussion, just when you think about operating artist-endowed foundations, and to John's earlier point, most of the time when you see artist and art-endowed foundations, again, they're a foundation, they're not a public charity, right? Either a grant-making foundation or an operating foundation. Early on, I think it's important to make that distinction, how you want to operate. And I really don't want to make this a tax course. I want this to be a very creative, artistic discussion, but I'll keep the accounting and the tax as light as possible. Just high level, private foundations have what we call distribution requirements. Generally speaking, foundations have a 5% distribution requirement based on their investment use assets. And to John's point, what kind of foundations do you want to create? Do you want to have a grant-making foundation, or do you want to have an operating foundation? And there's a really big, there's a distinction that needs to be made early on as part of the IRS filings. And they have different requirements and different ways to meet those requirements. So I think that's important to early on to understand those rules. For a grant-making foundation, simply you can make grants, and that's how you satisfy the distribution requirement, right? However, for an operating foundation, although you can make grants, those grants do not count towards meeting some of those distribution requirements. So for expenditures to qualify for those requirements, expenditures must be incurred directly for the active conduct of that exempt mission. So what does that mean? Operating foundation act almost as a hybrid between a public charity and a grant-making foundation or a foundation. So I think making that distinction, understanding how you want to operate, right? What's the mission of the foundation is key. And these are things, again, are unique to private foundations. Another thing, tax consideration for any foundation, whether it's a startup foundation or an existing foundation, is understanding the self-dealing rules. Self-dealing, just high level, again, I don't want to make this a tax course. Foundations, simply said, are prohibited from entering certain transactions with disqualified individuals. Now, a disqualified individual is a officer, director, or trustee of a foundation, and certain employees of a foundation, employees that can take on the same responsibility as an officer, director, or trustee. Also, their family members, any related and individuals to those individuals are considered disqualified persons. Now, the type of transactions. So the fact that a private foundation is not publicly funded as a public charity is that close relationship, and that's why these rules are applicable only to private foundations and not public charities. And the rule is not to have any transactions that would benefit the disqualified person. Now, there are exceptions to the rule, of course. Compensation, for example. An individual, a disqualified person, can receive compensation from a foundation as long as it's reasonable and the service provided is needed for the foundation to operate. However, the IRS is pretty clear on certain things you just can't do. An example of that would be rent. A foundation cannot pay a disqualified person rent. Now, I mentioned reasonableness, right? If it's a reasonable amount, it's okay. With rent, that is not the case. It can't, even if it's under market, even if it's $1, you're not allowed to have those type of transactions. Some of the self-dealing rules that every foundation should be aware of. Any loans to the disqualified person is a big no-no. A lot of times we see foundations get in trouble where a disqualified person uses a foundation issued credit card for personal use, although it could be an error. Right? Believe it or not, that's considered a loan to that individual. So those are the things you just want to kind of be mindful of as a foundation. A lot of times when we have startup foundations, that line is still blurred and it's still gray between the family and the foundation and what those assets are used for. What comes along with self-dealing, what we see, obviously, there's going to be penalties and taxes are subject on those transactions. But also, as we always say when we talk about private foundations, the reputational risk that comes along with that, right? The last thing you want to do as a foundation is end up in the news for having transactions that, technically they're not allowed. For most individuals may not understand what those transactions mean, but again, you don't want bad press for a foundation.
Right. Great. Thank you very much for that, Anan. And I know you keep saying that you don't want to make this, a tax seminar, but maybe keep doing that. We might be able to change that specialized knowledge CPE to a little bit of tax there. Just kind of following up and seeing John, do you have anything to add on to some of the considerations there on your legal side when, discussing these options and navigating, I guess, the transaction with your clients and getting the foundation set up for them. I know Anan touched on, self-dealing and some of those things, but, I guess IRS guidelines and other types of things that you might speak to with your clients.
Sure, so there's a lot. Just to think of a few that might come to mind. One thing, in response to something Anan mentioned about whether the private foundation is an operating foundation or a grant-making foundation or non-operating foundation. In fact, for most of the artist-endowed foundations, they are operating foundations because they expend most of their money on their own programs, whether it's scholarship regarding the artist, exhibition support, catalog raisonné, etc. They do also make grants, as Anan said. But the distinction actually isn't that important in that artist-endowed foundation sphere, in my experience at least. The distinction really matters for a donor, because a private foundation, and I'm not an accountant, but can report as either an operating foundation or a non-operating foundation. And I believe it's kind of a check the box thing. And the IRS doesn't care, is my understanding, which way you qualify if you're just the foundation filing your return. But if you're a donor who wants to get an income tax deduction, which is not the case in most artist-endowed foundations. Most artist-endowed foundations arise when someone dies. And that's when the bulk of a transfer of art and or financial assets happens. And you get the estate tax deduction, the estate tax charitable deduction, regardless of whether it's an operating foundation or a non-operating foundation. But in the collector sphere, going back to what Karen was referring to, a collector who wants to make a contribution of a work that he or she owns during their lifetime to an existing foundation will get a different deduction if they're giving it to an operating foundation, which is treated like a public charity, or to a grant-making foundation where they'll only get a deduction for their basis. Again, please correct me, you're the accountants, not me. But that distinction really matters for the donor, or if the foundation plans to go out and raise money. But in my experience with many of these artist-endowed foundations, they're not going out to raise money from the public. They are self-sufficient, whether they received proper inheritance to cover their needs, or they sell some of the assets that they receive, including the artwork, which is allowed. So that distinction, again, it's very important, and the accountants need to know what you are, and depends how you file, et cetera, and it has other implications. But primarily, it doesn't come up in most artist-endowed foundations, where again, the artist or the artist's spouse who has inherited the collection then makes the donation on the death of the survivor. So it's just worth mentioning.
John, you are correct, and we're always looking for good tax people. So if you want to join us, no.
Another consideration though that does come up, which is crucial, and you guys work on this, I know Scott and Anan, is are the art assets that are being contributed to the foundation to be deemed charitable use assets or investment assets? Because this 5% rule that Anan mentioned is based on investment assets. So if the private foundation is holding, I'm going to make up numbers, $100 million worth of charitable use assets and only $10 million in the bank, the 5% is computed on the $10 million. The question becomes, is an enormous art collection, which many of these artist-endowed foundations have, and they can vary in value enormously. Sometimes artists die with huge collections because there was no market for these works and nobody wanted to have to pay estate tax on them. So they put them all into a foundation. Sometimes it's a very successful artist who didn't have children, or their children were well taken care of already, and there are a whole host of reasons. And the issue is this 5% to be computed on all the art as well? And people have different points of view. The general thinking is, if you're using this art to support the legacy of the artist and the programming of the programs of the foundation, lending it out, letting scholars in to review, publishing, et cetera, the general feeling seems to be these are charitable use assets. But I've never seen the IRS question it, but there are some accountants who would say, you know, if you've got 1,000 works sitting in the warehouse, how can you take the position that they're all charitable use assets? I think they should be, and I've never seen it questioned, and that's how virtually every foundation reports. There are a couple of exceptions. The Andy Warhol Foundation, for example, doesn't treat any art that it still owns as charitable use assets. It views itself as a grant-making foundation, and these are investments. But that is the exception in that sphere. So that's another issue that has to be considered on an ongoing basis.
No, and you are right, John. Just to add to that, you know, working with our clients, we always say early on, make that determination, whether it was management and the board to get involved of what pieces you plan to sell and what pieces you plan to hold. And I always say, if you're in talks with an art dealer of selling a certain piece, that is an investment use asset. What's also important as a distinction while we go through this exercise, investment use assets have to be appraised. There's an appraisal that needs to be conducted annually because, again, they're investment use and that's part of the 5% required calculation. So making that determination, again, is key for many aspects, not only just for distribution requirements, but also for the appraisal.
Although we do still, I think every 5 years, we recommend that the foundations get their art collections, their charitable use assets appraised as well, and report that on their 990 PFs, which you prepare so well.
Correct.
Thank you. Hate to interrupt this, but Harleen, can we just launch the next polling question and give everybody a minute? So are you still participating? Hopefully you are, because this is getting very interesting. And I guess just in the interim, while we wait for the participants to answer this and for the polling question to close, you know, as Anan mentioned early on, this is a growing niche within the private foundation community that we've been seeing. And, you know, I guess throwing this over to Karen, you know, recently we've been seeing this growing niche and trend of popularity with artist-endowed foundations. And I guess, you know, what have you been seeing with your clients and I guess the discussions you've been having with them on this?
Yeah, I think the discussion is definitely coming. We're having the discussion much more frequently than we used to in the past. And a lot of times it's really around trying to educate the collectors around, you know, do you want to set up a private foundation? How are you going to actually run the foundation, right? Like what is the infrastructure you're going to need to actually support the foundation? We have a lot of conversations with clients about how they want to engage their children in this endeavor. And many times children of our clients are at a different place in their life, both personally and professionally, and the amount of time that they may have to devote to this endeavor may not actually align with the amount of time that their parents think they have to be able to devote to this endeavor. So we really need to have, you know, kind of a meeting of the minds of actually how this could potentially play out. So I think, you know, engaging the next generation, thinking about how they may be involved is another conversation that we're having. We're also trying to educate clients a little bit more when they think about a private foundation around the self-dealing rules, right? Because they're not really, you know, many times they think, well, I'll set up a private foundation and just keep the art in my home where it resides right now. And, you know, they can't do that, right? So I think most of our conversations are with art collectors and how they're thinking about what they want to do with their collection in the future. I think to John's point, many of our artists clients, most of that type of development of the foundation or establishment is really upon death. And at that point, it's really sort of all of the documentation and all of the thought process around how this will play out has already been established, right? And so all of that has been articulated and laid out. And so there's not as many discussions around what that's, going to look like. And John, I see you're kind of nodding your head around that comment.
That's true. I think one thing that I'm sure Karen deals with a lot, which we run into some, but I think collectors don't really understand how expensive it is to run an organization, and especially a museum, right? It's one thing to have a great collection, or a collection that you think should always stay together, whether because it's your aesthetic judgment or it represents what you and your spouse or the two did together, or for whatever reason. But these are very expensive propositions. And there's a well-known private foundation within the art world called Glenstone, Washington, and it's sort of the best example of these. And it was reported recently the owner just gave another $1.6 billion to his private foundation to keep it going. I mean, these are, not that everything has to cost that much, but these are very expensive propositions to run organizations. No question. And then to your point about self-dealing, I just can't resist. I had once someone come in and say, well, we have a foundation and the art is in, I said, where's the art? It's in our apartment in the city. They had a pied-à-terre. I said, well, you can't have it hanging in your apartment. And they said, but that's the address of our foundation. That's the mailing address. I said, that doesn't work. I mean, people really don't understand the self-dealing rules. It's crucial that we all explain them better.
Right.
No, I agree. I mean, I'm sorry. We have clients, like, for example, they say, well, we're going to donate our house with all of our artwork to the private foundation. And I say, well, where will you live? You can't live in your house now, right? And I think, so that's a consideration. And Anan, to your point around the 5%, right? Because if in fact these assets are donated as investment assets, you have to have some liquidity there as well to be able to make your 5% payout. So, while we don't give tax or legal advice, we do try to educate our clients to help them really think about what does this really look like and what type of infrastructure would you need to really support something of this magnitude.
Right, right.
Another aspect, just to throw out, if you don't mind, is sometimes people think, well, if I set up a foundation, I can employ my children, I can employ my friends, whatever, and it's a way to get money to these people. And that doesn't work either. I mean, you have to go through a whole process in these private foundations every year of setting compensation for the top level and be sure it's reasonable. And you have to see what other similarly situated foundations are doing in your geographic area, in your area of what you're working in this case, artist-endowed foundations, the size of your foundation. You can't just decide to pay your kid who comes in twice a week for a couple hours, $250,000 a year. It just doesn't work. And people don't understand that sometimes.
And I think that's, especially with a newly formed foundation where the family's around, that's where we get, there's that challenge. It's hard to let go of that legacy. It's hard to let go of, well, this was all at one point. And, I was working with a newly formed foundation not too long ago, and there was some dealing. There was some rent paid back and forth, and the family said, well, you know what? We'll just take the art back. We'll close the foundation. And well, no, it only goes one way. It doesn't go back. And again, these are things, but again, I think it's lack of understanding of these rules are convoluted in many ways. But again, important to note.
Yeah.
But I think you raise a good point around how people, they love their art collection, right? And they want others to be able to love their art collection as well. And so many times when we sort of have the discussion around private foundation, sometimes the decision is, well, I'm going to donate it to a museum then. I think that will, that will ensure that the collection is seen by others, and my children who may not be at the right point in their careers don't have to be involved. And that sounds good. However, you really have to work with museums or even educational institutions, because many times they may not love your collection as much as you do. And so there's really, going back to all those considerations, you're really going to want to make sure that you have someone in your corner to help you navigate that and to help you negotiate how you really want to see this playing out.
Right. Now, those are excellent points and tremendous. And Anan, I know John had mentioned the cost behind this and had mentioned that one example there. And I think, when we talk about some due diligence and best practices in relation to the collection and managing of inventory, you wanted to touch on a few things that, unfortunately, us auditors, we're always the bad guys, right? Or the bad folk. We come in and we talk about the cost of everything and all that kind of stuff. But, there is a decent amount of work that needs to be done. Karen, you touched on it, with the safekeeping at the various institutions and so forth. And then when you have your own private foundation that's managing the collection and the artwork, Anan, you could kind of talk to some of the best practices around that upkeep.
Look, I think when we think about private foundations, there are usually 4 areas of risk that, from our perspective, that we think about, right? Cybersecurity is one, and that's not really specific to private foundations. That's for any business. Grant making is another area. Tax and tax compliance, as we've seen, the tax rules are pretty complex. And then there's investments. So a typical private foundation, the largest asset it holds are those investments. For a artist-endowed foundation, it's a little different. So most of the time, generally speaking, it's the art. And unlike investments that are sitting in a brokerage account or in a custody account, the art is a tangible asset that could potentially walk out the door, right? So these are things you have to kind of think about early on when a foundation is set up or when the endowment comes in. And when we think about art, it's really the safekeeping of the art, right? Early on, whether, some sort of catalog resume, I think it's very important to have a comprehensive list of all of the pieces, all of the art that was donated, regardless of its condition or appraised value. If it's even a paintbrush or an easel that painter or the artist used, if it's a easel that they used to create the art, also important to be part of the inventory count. For many reasons. The last thing you want to do is something walk out of the foundation and end up on eBay. Again, there is that reputational risk you want to think about. A description of every piece, the history behind the piece, and a photograph of the piece should be part of this catalog. And this is essential, for the safekeeping, the tracking, and accounting for the artwork. This is a document, should be a living document. We always recommend the activity, any new purchases or any new additions to the collection should be accounted for, but also any deletions, meaning if there's something was donated, if something was sold, that should also be updated. The thought process here is if a foundation staff walks out tomorrow morning and new individuals come in, through that detail, they should know where every piece is and a description and the history behind that piece. Again, that's important. On the safety, in terms of space, we always recommend, obviously, art to be maintained in an environment that is suitable for housing the art, whether it's temperature controlled. Want to make sure you have some sort of backup generator as well, if needed. These are things you kind of think about because, again, this is more of a tangible asset than an investment, for example. The security over the art, meaning when the art moves from point A to point B, who's handling the art, right? What are the processes, the procedures that are in place to make sure the art gets where it needs to go? Art handlers are used. Are you using a reputable organization that understands and is known the space? Or the art handlers themselves, do they go through some sort of background check? Again, these are individuals that are handling, very valuable pieces. So again, these are things to kind of think about through this process. Inventory counts, I'm sure, my Art-Endowed foundations, it's constant conversation we need to have with them. How often do you do an inventory count? It depends on the size, obviously, of the organization. We have some foundations that have thousands and thousands of pieces. The point here is at least a spot count should be done annually, right? That's important psychologically for the individuals who are working with art to know there's accountability. Somebody's going to come in one day and look at this piece. So you want to make sure, again, to have that spirit and that understanding within the foundation. And in terms of, when it comes to safekeeping the art, safety is important, and insurance is just as important. You want to make sure you have sufficient insurance. Obviously, we don't expect every piece to be individually have an insurance policy in every piece, but a sufficient amount of insurance to cover any losses, whether it's theft or natural disaster. So those are the things, again, when you think about art and the actual pieces, in terms of safety and from an audit perspective, these are things I would think about.
I'd like to add something to what Anan said about the insurance. The art insurance is a real specialty. And if you have a substantial collection in particular, I think it's really crucial to use an insurance broker who is deeply experienced in insuring art, rather than just maybe your general insurance broker or commercial broker, because there are very specific terms that these experienced brokers put into these policies. And it takes experience and knowledge of what that would be. Just like if you were insuring a nuclear facility, you wouldn't go to your just everyday insurance broker down the street who's insured your house. And this is as specialized. And I've been involved, fortunately, with very large collections, and there are pages and pages sometimes that deal with particular issues with the insurance coverage, and also a broker who can guide you in keeping the broker or the insurance company, the underwriter, up to date on what you're doing. It's an enormous benefit if you're moving something. If you're going to lend your $50 million Rothko painting to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, let your insurance company know beforehand that you're doing it. They may have requirements. They may say, we need to approve who's transporting it. We need to approve the conditions in which it's going to be kept. And if you don't ask them beforehand and you come to them later and say, oh, somebody drove a forklift truck through our Rothko during the installation, they may say, well, you are covered, but if you had told us beforehand, whatever. You're so much better off getting these things approved, even if it's just knowledge, right? Just transfer the information to your broker. You're on record that you're lending this work. They don't come back to you with anything. You're in a much better position than if you hadn't let them know. But a specialized insurance broker in the art world, I find, is a crucial aspect to any team that's representing a private foundation that has art assets. The other thing, by the way, and this goes to everything Anan was talking about, these foundations are nonprofit organizations. They may be formed as a charitable trust, they may be formed as a corporation, but the board of directors or the board of trustees are fiduciaries. And you have obligations to the Internal Revenue Service, to the Attorney General of your state, and to the general public. It's not just like treating your own art collection at home, which you may decide to underinsure, you may decide to turn it upside down or put it in a box that isn't a proper crate or whatever. You can't do that. You have liabilities as a member of this board that is overseeing the staff to be sure that things are done right. And I think that's a very important thing to keep in mind.
Great, thank you, John. Before we get into the next question, Harleen, can you just launch? Yep. So one more. We have two more. This is the third and fourth. While we wait for everybody to answer, as we were talking about, some of those best practice and due diligence, we kind of touched on some of the topics under this previously. But John, in terms of considerations for the tax side, when we're talking about that, you sort of mentioned that a lot of times it's already set up in estates and trusts, and upon death it gets transferred over. Is that, what type of process is that? Is that something you're involved in early on, kind of discussing with those families of the artists? And what are kind of the I guess, considerations and best practices you provide to them when these are set up?
Let's see, so much to say. It's obviously, it is crucial that the documentation for the formation of the private foundation is done right, because you are doing this in part to avoid taxes, whether it's you want a charitable deduction at the time of the gift, you want to avoid estate taxes at the time of the death, or you want to avoid income when you sell assets and otherwise operate the foundation and come under and get the benefits. There are lots of restrictions of being a private foundation that we discussed, but there are also benefits. And so you have to be sure those documents are done right, or you're not going to get that, and you're certainly not going to get approved by the IRS when you apply. So we are sure that our clients' wills or their revocable trusts or these documents, if they're doing it as an inter vivos project, comply with that. So I think that's very, very important. The transfer of these assets into a private foundation on someone's death, the transfer itself is actually quite simple. There's no, it's just a document. I hear, you know, the executors or the trustees of the revocable trust just signed a document that says we hereby transfer all right, title, and interest to the works on Schedule A to Foundation X, and the Foundation X accepts it. There's no complicated process in that. What's much more complicated in when, I'm not sure it's where you want me to go, so shut me up if I'm not going where you want me to go, but is deciding very often with these artist-endowed foundations, how much of the art is going to go into the foundation? Because often this is a tax-driven and estate tax-driven process, because artists or the surviving spouse are terrified that when this art collection becomes taxable, they won't be able, the family won't be able to afford the estate taxes. Because if mom or dad died owning 1,000 works of art that they created, you can't put that on the market and liquidate it so easily. But your tax is going to be due. You may get time to pay your tax, but the IRS is the Treasury Department's a very expensive banker. And it's a real challenge, a huge challenge. So we spend enormous amounts of time doing tax projections. It's a complicated procedure because there's something called blockage discount we won't get into today, which is very hard to predict. You don't know what the tax law is going to be when you die. We had a major estate of an artist who died in 2010 when there was no federal estate tax. So didn't have to worry about estate planning or tax planning at the time the person died. And it could happen again, depending on who takes control of the Congress and the White House, but you can't count on that. So we've come up with a procedure that lets the family decide after death, actually within 9 months, how much goes into the foundation and how much doesn't. And that's something that is right for some families. But it's a major issue of how you're going to pay your taxes. To Karen's point about collectors, yes, it's not, art collection isn't a liquid asset the way a portfolio of stocks and bonds is liquid. You can't liquidate it the next day. But I think people often don't understand how liquid art can be. Someone dies in January, you can put their entire collection, whether it's a $1 million collection, a $100 million collection, or a $500 million collection at auction over the next 6 months. And it will be sold. Almost all of it will be sold. You will know, you will have your cash. I'm making it a bit simple. If you're talking at the high level, sometimes collectors get payment terms, so you won't have your cash within 9 months necessarily, but most of it will come in. You'll know your estate tax value and you'll have liquid assets. Even at a very low level, auction works. You may want to sell to a private dealer, but art collections can be liquidated, even large art collections with a large variety of artists. If it's all by one artist, for all intents and purposes, you can't liquidate it in 6 months or 9 months or a year. And that gets very scary because if it's taxable, it's a long process of dealing with the IRS on how art is valued for estate tax purposes. And the IRS has a whole division that deals with this, but it's years before you know. And so there's no predicting where you're going to come out with the IRS. So it's very treacherous to do that. So that's a big part of how you decide of the process of what goes into the foundation. But the actual transfer into the foundation is not a very complicated procedure.
Right. No, John, thank you for that. And I think that you've sort of proved Karen's point earlier about when, people are starting to think about doing this, making sure that you're speaking with the right individuals who can guide you and give you the expertise in the tax planning, estate planning, and just the considerations that are needed for this. Because, as you said, just even high level, that seems like a pretty daunting task for an individual who's not necessarily knowledgeable in that area to undertake and undertake with somebody very similar to insurance, as you mentioned. You need somebody that's specialized in that area to go to make sure that they put you on the right path. So, we are running low on time, which, believe it or not, is crazy. Time flies when you're having fun, right? That old saying. But the last question that we have here, Karen, is talking about looking ahead to the future. And I think you kind of touched on that a little bit, especially when you spoke of some of the clientele that you have and getting their family involved and stuff like that. So, if you wouldn't mind just kind of touching on what you think the future ahead looks like for Artist-Endowed Foundation.
So I think the art market is definitely booming, right? And I think that more and more you will see families that do want to create foundations, and they do want the ability to share their art with others. I do think, though, that the trend that I am seeing is that sometimes the younger generation is not as enamored or feels compelled to continue with that particular artist or that particular collection. So I think we will probably see more and more of collectors and definitely artists themselves creating their own foundations during estate planning. But I think that we may see a pullback a little bit from the younger generations that may not want to be involved, and that's okay. I think that the family just needs to recognize, okay, what would the infrastructure look like if my daughter or son was not involved? Like, how can I still accomplish my goals, but potentially my daughter is not the one that will be running this?
I'd like to add one thing to what Karen said, which is there's this enormous tension with collectors that collectors have to face between giving a work or their collection to a museum, where in almost every case, unless it is very, very special, it is not going to be on the walls 24/7, 365 days a year. And in most cases, it's going to be on the wall once every 10 years if they're lucky, right? Unless you have great works, or you're working with a museum that really needs your collection, which is a wonderful thing to do. Not everyone needs to give to the great museums of America. People are afraid, if I give my collection or my work to my local museum or my favorite museum or the museum I have a relationship with or I'm a trustee of, it's just going to sit in storage and no one is ever going to see it. So that is an impetus to doing a foundation and being able to lend the works out to institutions temporarily so they can be on view and maybe move around, almost function as a library, a lending library, or set up an operating foundation that's going to run a museum. But again, as I mentioned before, and as Karen knows, it's very, very expensive to do that. So, but there is that tension between, if you give it to the Met, is anyone ever really going to see it? Because they already have, again, making this up, 5 great Rothkos. Do they need a 6th great Rothko? Will anyone ever see it? Much less the 2nd or 3rd tier Rothko. They're all great, but and so that's a real discussion that is an attention that's always there. I find. I'm sure Karen does too.
And I think what people also have to consider just very quickly is there are ways and museums and educational institutions you can work with that may not be the high-end museums, and you will actually be able to ensure that your art is on display and that others are able to enjoy and love the artwork as much as you are. So a lot of times, it might be in your best interest to think about some other maybe local or smaller museums that would absolutely be willing to take a full collection, especially if it fits into their curatorial focus, or if maybe they want to start a new focus, right? Like maybe you go to the museum and say, look, I have this particular artist. I know this is not exactly in your wheelhouse, but would you consider thinking about this? And a lot of times that can start the discussion.
You know, Karen and John, all great points. And Karen, the point you made earlier about, you know, the children of collectors, you know, and I think this is not unique to Art-Endowed foundations. I think just next gen, generally speaking, sometimes may not have the same passions or interests as their parents, but those are great points.
Yeah.
It's especially complicated with artists and their children because so many, especially the great artists, they've put a lot of their life into their art. Right. And in some cases more than energy they put into their children. And it's it's all can happen with collectors too. I've seen that. And it's a very emotional thing to deal with.
Right.
It is.
Well, so I guess we'll conclude on that if that's okay. I just want to thank Karen and John once again for lending your expertise and knowledge in here, and of course Anan as well. But you know, it was very informative, very helpful information. We do have one last CPE question, but there were, and Harleen, if you could just launch that, there were a couple questions that came in that I would like to just pose to the group here. One question, Anan, how often does a collection need to be appraised?
You know, as I mentioned earlier, it really depends on what type of asset it is, whether investment versus charitable use. So, and again, this is, you know, from a tax, with my tax hat on, if it is considered to be held for investment, generally speaking, it should be appraised annually. Now, the appraisal can be done internally by managers and employees of the foundation in that case, but it should be appraised annually.
Okay.
Whereas, as John mentioned earlier, if it's held for charitable purposes, that is not the case.
Okay, great, thank you. We had a couple general questions. You know, obviously, we don't want to sell services for anybody here, but are there any sites or any sort of resources where individuals could look for, John, as you mentioned, specialized art insurance companies, or anything that can be utilized for some foundations that might be looking for that? Same thing in terms of art brokers. If individuals are looking to deassess some pieces of collection, are there any resources available that maybe we could share with them at the end of the session? I don't know, not John, or
I'm not aware of any websites that list. I mean, they may exist, insurance brokers who focus on the art world. It's more, I think, knowing people who are operating the art world and getting advice from them as to who is good and who they've had good experience with and who's responsive, et cetera. And the same with brokers. I mean, the art brokerage business is a very big one, and you have auction houses. Anyone can walk into an auction house and say, can I talk to someone? It's nice to have an introduction, but, you know, and they will gladly try to sell your art. There are art dealers who are doing this all the time. There are individual art advisors. There are art lawyers who do this. You know, it's across the business, and it really depends on the needs and the assets involved. But I don't know of a source as such of that either.
You know, look, I agree with John. I think we barely scratched the surface here in the discussion in terms of the complexities, the legal and accounting and tax issues that come with artist-endowed foundations. I think it's essential for any, whether it's a startup foundation or an existing foundation, to really surround itself by advisors that understand the art world, whether it's appraisals, you know, attorneys, you know, tax, to understand the private foundation arena. I think that's key. And then just quickly, Scott, you asked if there's any websites. You know, there's one organization I think it's very helpful, and we've worked with the Aspen Institute, Art-Endowed Foundation Initiative. Great really great resource for many artist-endowed foundations. Again, just helping those foundations navigate the landscape and understanding many of the things that we spoke about today.
Yes, I will second that, because the Aspen Institute has a great initiative dealing with artist-endowed foundations. They really spearheaded a lot of the exchange of information and best practices, and it's grown, and this is such a growing field, and they've really been at the forefront of it.
Agreed.
Yeah. So we're at 1 o'clock. Once again, thank you all very much. Very appreciative of you joining and taking the time today to share your expertise with us. And I will hand this back to Harleen to close it out.
Thank you, Scott, and thank you to the rest of our speakers, and thank you everyone for attending. Please remember to complete the short survey prompted at the close of this webinar. A recording of today's webinar will be made available to all attendees via email within the next few hours, as well as on our Insights section of our webpage. CPE certificates will be issued within 8 to 10 days via email. Thank you again and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Thank you.